Hello, this is my handsome friend Werner Stepner, and then I'm gonna interview with him today about his life, his story. That I was very impressed when the first time I listened to his story, because it's kind of almost a dream for us to even believe in it. So now he was born in 1940s. As we all know, the beginning of the World War II, and then he will be explaining and telling us about his story from the very beginning of survival, and then the communism, and then escaping from Europe and coming to America. And now it's on Werner.
Well, I was born in 1940 in what is now Poland, and at that time Poland was under German rule. Hitler invaded Poland in 1939, so we came out of Latvia and Russia. My parents were born in Russia, my brother and sister were born in Latvia, and so Hitler took us then out of these countries because of the treaties that Hitler signed with Stalin. Then we came back into Germany. So we were on farms in Poland, where we literally came into Poland, and we were asked by the German government, Hitler, to go to a certain area and just say, this is okay, this land I want to take. We told the farmers they can either work for us for slave labor or go to the concentration camp. So they worked for us from 1939, excuse me, until 1945. They worked for us on their own land. And so then in 1945, of course, during this time period, my father went off to war. My brother went into to a very elite school for future Nazi officers. My sister was in a school to learn how to train other women to become better housewives and that, and so she was that, and so then it was strictly my sister. I'm the youngest of four. My sister, myself, we stayed home with my mother, and she took care of the complete land, everything, because my father was into war. So we lived there under these conditions until 1945, February. And in February, when the big retreat came, when Germany was losing the war, we were asked to evacuate temporarily, but we already knew that was a problem, so we packed and butchered some pigs, and with horses, covered wagons with horses drawn. In February of 1945, we left to go west, to go across the Elbe River to the Allies and escape the Russians, because they were coming in so fast, and when they came in, they would just massacre and kill the people, or put them in wagons, in trains, in open trains like cattle, and ship them off to Siberia, and just open up in the frozen tundra, and just said, here, 50% of the people were killed during that time. So we were escaping west. Then I'd like to share one situation with so many of them. The experience as a young child of 5 years old, these highlights I remember. We came to a river right outside of Berlin with our horses and wagons, and the river was frozen. There was only one bridge there that had not been exploded, dynamited, and the German soldiers would not allow anybody to come close, because they were waiting for a couple tank divisions to come across, and they already had dynamite there. They were going to explode it, and we couldn't do that. So my mother was with the wagons, and I remember this very clearly. We were standing by the river with the horses, everything, and there were thousands of people next to the river there. Nobody wanted to go across the river, and she says, I'm either going to die in the river, but I'm not going to die under the tanks of the Russians. So she just said, I'm going to go across. And I remember how the horses started going with the wagon down the embankment, and on that ice, and the ice was cracking like rifle shots. To this date, I still remember that as a 5-year-old child. And we made it across. When those people saw that they could make it across, they came en masse across, and then all of these people, they just in the middle, ice broke, and there's hundreds of people that just drowned to death right there. And we were the ones that made it across. And at that same time, it was one of the coldest winters that Europe had ever had for many, many years. My feet were frostbitten, and they wanted to amputate my feet, but there were no hospitals, nothing available. So we had to just keep on going because there was no hospital, no medical care. So they wrapped up my feet in sacks, and to this date I still have the scars of all of that, but they didn't amputate, and so I survived. So we came then west into across the Elbe, and of course that was the dividing line where the Allies came to that point and the Russians to that point. So now we were in the Allied land south of Hamburg on the west side of the Elbe River. At that time, there was nothing that we had except some food that we had brought along as farmers. So we had to then, and this was now February in 1945, in that cold winter, and we lived with 13 people in one little room, no stove, nothing. And the room, the doors were locked up because the Allies had set up in this house
And one more thing, especially allies, you mean England, France,
Germany.
Italy,
But this
against Germany?
Right. This was in the British zone, the northern part, the British. The Americans were more in the south, but so we were in the British.
So they had more power against Germany after World War One.
Well, yes, Germany was being defeated.
Yes.
And there was no structure, no government, anything, and the people, and what we went through, the soldiers, the Allied soldiers, English, British, American, they would come, many of the soldiers would come in at nighttime and rape 50, 70-year-old women, and it's just terrible what we went through and all of that. So we survived, and we would go out that cold, we would go out, and we would actually go and pick mushrooms in the forest for food. We would pick wild berries, and we would sell those then so that we could have some money to buy some other food, bread, sugar, and some of the staples. And it wasn't, and then we received from America care packages where they would bring ship some fat and some clothing. And that was just like a present from heaven to get something like that. There was no government, nothing. I started to work, a 5-year-old kid driving tractors in the farm. My next oldest sister, she was working for 11 years old, she was working on the farm and on the farmers. And then my older brother, he started to work too, and he was also going to university, and then my other sister also. So my father then became very ill in 1948, and he could not work anymore. So he was bedridden, had muscular dystrophy, and so he then died soon after that. So we were strictly with my mother, and the kids survived, and we survived working very, very hard. And then our relatives, they started to, rather than us, when we went from into Latvia and into Poland, we had relatives that then went directly to America and Brazil, and so then we had relatives already in America from 1920 to 1930. Then we made contact with them, and they then started to start the paperwork. And so in 1948 we were allowed to, it was progressing that we could come, but my father was ill and they would not let a ill person come to America, so we had to wait until he died, and that was in 1953 when he finally died. And I, at the age of, at 52, at the age of 12, I already was elected out of 3 students from our total district to bypass high school altogether and go directly to college. So I was from 52 already in college. And then when we finally got our papers to come to America in 1953, of course my father had just died, and I had a ruptured appendicitis, and I spent 3 months in the hospital at that time. And we just got penicillin for medicine because at first they were going to let me just die and shoved off in the hospital because they couldn't do anything. And then they were allowed to, within a couple of hours, my mother pleaded with the German government to not let me die. And I kept saying to the doctors, I said, I cannot die, I've got to come to America, I've got to come to America. So then the German government authorized to use penicillin, and that saved me through, so I spent 3 months in the hospital then. And then we finally, after I came out of the hospital, we got the papers and the quota number to come here, and so we came in 1954 to America. This was a shock. This was an absolute shock, because I